Tonight on Greater Boston from the Boston Public Library, Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse joins me on his new book, The Scheme, How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court, about the decades-long plot to buy far-right anti-majoritarian rulings from the Supreme Court. Plus, the great Lidia Bastianich is celebrating 25 years of teaching America to cook on PBS. She joins me on that, her mentor Julia Child, and just in time for Thanksgiving, her secret to the perfect turkey. When the draft opinion signaling the end of Roe was leaked in May, many were shocked, not only that the Supreme Court was poised to overturn it, but at how a leak of this magnitude could come out of the country's highest court. And now, it looks like this wasn't the first leak of its kind. A former anti-abortion leader, Reverend Rob Schenck, reportedly sent a letter to the Chief Justice in June telling him about information he got back in 2014 and pointing the finger at Justice Alito. In the letter, Schenck says a donor told him she would be dining at the home of Justice Alito and might be able to learn the status of the Hobby Lobby case and whether the First Amendment grants private companies the right to deny birth control coverage to employees on the basis of religious beliefs. Afterwards, the donor told Schenck how the court was going to decide weeks before it was made public, information he used to prep himself and the CEO of Hobby Lobby for the announcement. But when it comes to very wealthy conservatives using their money and anonymity to exert undue influence over the Supreme Court, Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse argues leaks are just the tip of the iceberg. He lays it all out in his new book, The Scheme, How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. Senator joins me now. Senator Whitehouse, it's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me back on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Expand a little bit. What is the scheme exactly?
Well, if you go back in American history, there is a phenomenon called regulatory capture, where a regulatory agency gets taken over by the industry. It's supposed to regulate. Envision railroad barons taking over the railroad commission that sets the rates for their railroad. My case in this book is that that's what's happened to the Supreme Court, that it was taken over, captured in effect, by right-wing special interests who had been defeated in the democratic parts of our government, and therefore went to the least democratic branch, the Supreme Court, to take it over and use it to impose their will. And they did so using that very dangerous tool in a democracy, dark money.
So let's go back about 50 years to a couple of things I'd like to focus on that you mentioned in your book. There was a report from a corporate lawyer in 1971 done at the request of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in which he concluded that an activist-minded Supreme Court might be the best instrument for social and political change in this country. Who wrote that thing?
A tobacco and corporate lawyer named Lewis Powell.
Whatever happened to him?
Well, what did happen to him? About 4 months after he turned that report into the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he was sworn in to the United States Supreme Court as Mr. Justice Powell. And in his seat on that court, he very carefully over years built a pathway for corporate power using his seat on the Supreme Court to craft an increasingly broad role for corporations in American politics and elections.
By the way, at his confirmation hearing, did he disclose this thing he had produced for the U.S. Chamber?
He did not. The United States Senate was completely unaware of this very, very significant piece of writing that he had performed for a very, very powerful lobby group. Today, far and away the most powerful lobby group in Washington. So
fast forward 40 years, I think everybody watching has heard about Citizens United. Unlimited anonymous contributions changed the world big time, obviously from the Supreme Court. But I want to segue into a footnote in your piece that I think you described it as a bit of a confession. On a great many occasions, Democrats at many levels failed to fight back or give public warning as the scheme progressed. It was worse than appeasement. It was acceptance. And I think in that footnote, you weren't talking specifically about, for example, the failure to even hold a hearing on Merrick Garland. But would that not fall into that same category about essentially acceptance of one of the most grotesque moments in, I would argue, Supreme Court confirmation or non-confirmation history?
Yes. You know, as Democrats, we often get involved in episodic emoting about our defeats, but we have not been as good at looking carefully at what caused them, at what the apparatus was up against us and how it achieved its success. So we don't tell the public the actual full story. And so we complained and groused about Garland not getting a hearing and said how unprecedented it was, but we never went back and connected the dots to the dark money forces that fund Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate, the dark money forces that pick who gets onto the Supreme Court, the dark money forces that pay for the advertising for those nominees in TV ad campaigns, and the dark money forces that then turn up in the court in little flotillas of brief writing amici curiae, they're called, friends of the court, and give the Federalist Society judges their operating instructions.
And what we are produced out of that in one amazing week in June of this year was a decision on guns and the ability to carry one in public for self-defense that the public didn't agree with. Here's a poll, Monmouth, 56% were on the other side of that. A limitation on what the EPA could regulate in terms of emissions. Here's another poll from Progress, where 60% of Americans are on the other side. And then, of course, Dobbs overturning Roe v. Wade, where 57% of Americans are on the other side. Is there a plan to deal with your colleagues with these anti-majoritarian decisions, or is acceptance what's going to happen here too? I mean, the public, voters didn't accept Dobbs in a number of states. We know the impact that had. But how about your 49 colleagues, maybe 50 in the Senate?
I think there's been a big shift in recent months, and that was much accelerated by the public reaction to the Dobbs decision. I think senators, Democratic senators, are much more alert to and aware of, concerned about the capture of the court. They're more and more reading other writers than myself, people like Linda Greenhouse and Dahlia Lithwick and Jeff Toobin and others, talking in very similar terms about the capture of the court, about looking at the forces who operate behind the Federalist Society justices. And so I think we're going through a very important shift as a caucus to pay more accurate attention to what is really going on. And with that, I think we have the ability to bring to the American people a clearer understanding of what has gone wrong at the court that opens the aperture to better and stronger reform of the court.
Well, you know, forget your colleagues for a second. For any of us watched the confirmation hearings and your tutorials with your little whiteboard or whatever it was, where you're doing an important educational thing for the American people about dark money. I mean, people like Larry Tribe and former federal judge Nancy Gertner have been on the show repeatedly. They were on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court. They went into those meetings supporting term limits, came out supporting expansion, because they believe term limits require a constitutional amendment. Expansion just requires a majority of vote in Congress. Not that either is easy. My understanding is, though, you have legislation that would term limit them. Is it after 18 years? Am I right about that?
Correct. And we make it retroactive, so it would actually go into effect sooner than 18 years. Obviously, there will be legal quarrels about whether it can be retroactive, but I thought that was the right place to start. We also have a whole array of transparency legislation related to the court, because a lot of the mischief they get away with because things are done from behind screens, behind masks, or in hiding.
Well, you also, isn't there legislation you have pending that require that dark money be sunshine being that best disinfected? Wouldn't you require that, contributions over 10 grand or some such thing, the donor be disclosed?
Yeah, we do, and we apply that to political campaigns for Supreme Court nominees also, not just for election to Congress. So that's important. Finding out who's behind these amicus curiae briefs that are basically false front briefs is important. And as recent events have shown, much, much more honest disclosure by the justices of where they're getting gifts, hospitality, and emoluments is important.
Yeah, I want to get to gifts and dinners in a second. But one more thing about this public disclosure, which is not, to me, it shouldn't be seen as a radical notion. Forget on the floor of the Senate. If you're having a conversation with a sane Republican colleague, which may sound oxymoronic to some, and you say to him or her, what possible objection could one have to simply disclosing the source of the contribution? What's the response?
The response is driven by the power of a handful of very, very big Republican donors over the Republican Party in Congress. It's driven by the fact that Mitch McConnell has made this an absolute red line within his caucus, again, driven by a handful of very, very big funders, people who can write 10, 20, $50 million checks to back up his political operation. So it's hard to have a legit conversation because the shadow of the whip from the donors is very much over the heads of this caucus.
By the way, speaking of Mitch McConnell, there's a brilliant, I'm saying this to the viewers, there's a brilliant Frontline documentary on how Mitch McConnell, as a mere senator, decided after Robert Bork was denied confirmation to go on this crusade, which he has stayed on laser-like, not unlike you and your relentlessness on these issues. Let's go to this Alito, this alleged Alito leaking that I mentioned at the introduction to you, Senator. And even though Justice Alito is saying that it's not the truth, the New York Times spent months working on the story before it published it, and they conclude that Reverend Schneck's argument was compelling and factual. My understanding is you wrote a letter, you and a colleague wrote a letter to the Chief Justice asking what he is doing to look into this. Do you expect a meaningful response from Chief Justice Roberts?
You know, I think sooner or later, the Chief Justice is going to have to engage in a sincere and serious way with these problems. So we're going to keep pursuing him to do exactly that. This began back in September when my coordinate in the House Judiciary Court Subcommittee, Chairman Hank Johnson, and I wrote to the Chief Justice about this very organization and about its pattern of bringing in very wealthy right-wingers to wine and dine the justices of the court, and with the specific intention of trying to influence them in their decisions. And how the court had gone along with this, or certain justices had gone along with this, and what he was going to do about it. And we got an extremely bland reply from a court official back saying, we have a code of ethics. So when this broke, we wrote back to them and said, hey, you really need to answer our question. Saying that we have a code of ethics doesn't answer the question of whether it was broken. And it certainly doesn't solve the problem of a court that has no inquiry, no place where complaints can be lodged, no fact-finding, no determination, and no reporting as to what the outcome was as regards ethics concerns. So they have to, at some point, make the code of ethics real and practical in the court by building the infrastructure that everybody has around an ethics code to investigate, determine, and declare what the result was.
By the way, that presidential commission, as you know, one of the things they looked into was having former federal judges serve as some sort of oversight board to hear questions about recusal and ethics. Speaking of recusal, the one that puts me totally over the edge, everybody watching obviously knows about Ginny Thomas and Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas is the lone dissenter on a case about turning over Trump records. Lo and behold, we find out what's in those Trump records. Among other things, messages his wife sent to people like the chief of staff for Donald Trump. And that same Chief Justice Roberts is willing to stand up and decry the leak of the Dobbs decision, but it's been crickets on the issue of recusal on the part of Justice Thomas. Is there any argument against Thomas recusing himself in cases where his wife has involvement, Senator?
So this is a double-decker problem. The original problem was that Justice Thomas said he knew absolutely nothing, hadn't a clue, not the faintest inkling of his wife's engagement in this insurrection activity. That is a factual proposition. Factual propositions lend themselves to investigation. The Chief Justice has shown that he's willing to investigate things by having an investigation into the Alito Dobbs opinion leak. Why not, we have suggested to the Chief Justice, investigate the facts of what Thomas knew and when he knew it, so that we actually have a common factual platform to decide whether he should have recused himself. That's the first slice. The second is that he voted again recently in a related case involving investigations around the insurrection. And by now, whatever he knew in that earlier case, by now he definitely knows what his wife was up to, because it's been all the newspapers. And yet he still did not recuse himself, and we don't have an explanation for that. So the silence and the lack of discipline and the lack of order and process peculiar around a court with respect to these ethics things has really become a very acute problem for the Chief Justice.
You know, going forward, I read an interview you did, I think it was in February of this year, with the Guardian, in which you suggested you thought what the Supreme Court would do on Roe v. Wade was, quote, nibble away at it. And by the way, I shared your perspective. We were both obviously dead wrong. And
Yep.
I worry that despite the fact that people in some states rose up and voted against Republicans on the issue of the Dobbs case, that the fact that they didn't nibble away at it, but totally overturned a 50-year-old precedent, just emboldens them to do more of the same going forward. Is there any reason to believe that June was just an opening act for this sixum?
I think there's every reason to believe that their ambitions to change the way America operates into alignment with the interests of the very big donors who got them onto the court in the first place is very, very strong. They are not a court that wants to honor precedent. They don't want to just call balls and strikes. They want to change the strike zone. They don't want to be modest. They want to be activist. And when they find an opening, they swing for the fences. So there's no reason to believe that on an issue like abortion, they would be so unrestrained, but when they move on to other issues, they'd suddenly find a restraint to be of value. It's one of the reasons I think that putting a spotlight on them and keeping the spotlight on them is important, because they do go outside the chalk lines in these decisions. And to call them out for the violation of appellate process and tradition, and in some cases even law, I think is essential at this stage.
You know, before you go, I'll tell you in advance, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll tell you what I want the answer to be in advance. The answer I want to be is yes, they do. And the question is, do your constituents care about these issues? I don't mean the individual issues. Obviously, some people care about guns. Others care about the right to reproductive freedom. Other people care about the ability of EPA to regulate emissions from power plants. But do your constituents care about the whole issue of dark money and justices being bought and their decisions being bought, or is this just a personal crusade?
I think it's both. When I started, it was a personal crusade based on evidence that I saw, that I felt obliged to share with people. But as the court has increasingly made the case for me, it's become more apparent both to advocacy groups like civil rights groups and environmental groups and good government groups that something is seriously wrong. And it's also become much more apparent to regular voters that something has gone seriously wrong at the court. And so I think a lot of people who might have ignored my case in the beginning are now taking a second look at it and thinking, you know, I think there's something to this now. So there's been, in my personal experience, a very big shift. I'm not a lonely guy any longer.
Well, that was the answer I was looking for. Senator Whitehouse, as always, thanks. Congratulations on the book, and thanks for your time.
Thanks so much. Good to be on with you.
Senator Whitehouse's book, again, is The Scheme, How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. Next up, there are just a little more than 24 hours left until Thanksgiving, and all I can think about is food. So rather than fight it, I've chosen to embrace it. And I've enlisted one of the best in the business to join me. You may know her by her catchphrase.
Tutti a tavola a mangiare.
I love that. That would be the great Lidia Bastianich, host of Lydia's Kitchen on PBS. She's celebrating her 25th year on public TV this fall. She'll be at Italy, Boston on December 6th. But first, she joins me here on Greater Boston from one of her restaurants in New York, Becco. Lydia's a two-time Emmy Award winner, 7-time James Beard Award-winning chef, best-selling cookbook author, and the restaurateur behind Italy. Good to see you, Lydia.
Oh, pleasure being on the show. Thank you for having me, Jim.
So, Lidia, you're just signing books, you told me, at Becco. What's a typical day in the life of Lidia Bastianich? What do you do all day?
It's all about food. Well, you know, I do visit my restaurants on a regular basis, talk with the chef, talk the menu. Then I do events like this, book signing. I do cooking classes at Italy, at our store Italy. And I travel. And, you know, Italy is across the United States. And so I travel. You know, I'm coming to Boston again. I've been not too long ago. And it's all about food and traveling and spreading the good word.
Well, you're not doing any of those things on Thanksgiving because you told Marjorie Egan and me on the radio you're cooking for 22 family and friends, which is just terrifying to me. So let's think small. What's the secret to the perfect turkey on Thanksgiving, Lidia?
Well, I think it's, you know, getting a good turkey. You know, I like a natural turkey, no hormones, none of that stuff.
Actual turkey.
I like to season it well 2 days before, leave it in the refrigerator, let it dry nice, and then you put it in the oven. But I take a cheesecloth and I put some melted butter, some wine, some seasoning, and then I soak the cheesecloth and cover the bird with that. And periodically go back and forth and baste the bird with the juices and the vegetables that are in the roasting pan. The question is not to cook it, certainly. So with that thermometer, you know, make sure that you're on time. And you know what I do at the end when I remove the cheesecloth? I take a little bit of balsamic reduction and I brush the bird about a half an hour before, and it's delicious. It becomes nice mahogany color. So you know, it's good products and simple preparations.
So just text me and tell me what time to come over. You know, speaking of coming over, I'm cooking for 6 on Thanksgiving. I love cooking, but when people are coming over, I'm caused great anxiety. Did you feel anxiety a bunch of years ago when 2 people named Julia Child and James Beard walked into your restaurant to check out your risotto?
I certainly did. You know, I remember, you know, when they walked through the door, I was peeking from the kitchen window, and I saw these 2 big, humongous figures coming in because they were both big. And I did get a little palpitations. But you know what? If you know what you're doing, you're sure of yourself, you do the best that you can, and you move on. So a little palpitation is good. The adrenaline's going. You're going to do a great job.
Well, yeah, it's easy for you to say. You know, you obviously developed a relationship with her. I know you took her to a house, and ultimately she had you on her show. And by the way, we have some fabulous footage. This is from a 1993 episode of Julia Child's show, Cooking with Master Chefs. You were the featured master chef that day, and after you demonstrated the recipe, you all ate together at the dinner table, 3 generations of your family there. And
yeah,
it's
that's
just,
my house.
It's really, it is, look at, oh my God, look at that. That is just incredible. And by the way, it's fair to say, were it not for those appearances on Julia Child's show after you met her, there wouldn't be 25 years of you on PBS, would there?
Well, no, she was actually very instrumental. That show kind of put me in front of a lot of people. And the producer says, you know, Lidia, you're pretty good. How about a show? And she really egged me on. She says, Lidia, you can do it. You can do for Italian food what I did for French food. And so she was with me. We remained friends until the very end. And I must say that, you know, I really studied her mannerism on television, the way she was concerned about the viewers understanding and ultimately cooking. And I think that's what, you know, a show is all about. It's, you know, if you have the viewers give you half an hour of their time, they better take something away from that show.
Well, I think 25 years is the proof is in the pudding. So I'm assuming a couple of popes, Benedict and Francis, must have been watching the show and said, hey, I like that woman and what she does, no?
Yeah, I had the honor of cooking for both of them when they came here to the United States. And there I got a little apprehensive. You know, what do you cook the Pope? Especially the first one was Ratzinger, Pope Ratzinger. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's. I still pinch myself. Is it possible? Not one, but two popes. Let me tell you, they love to eat. They have their wine. They love dessert. And it was wonderful, you know, because when popes travel, they don't sleep in hotels or we eat in restaurants, they go to the nuncio's house, which is the ambassador to the United Nations. So I moved in with the Pope for the 3 days.
Moved in with the Pope. That's an expression most of us are not able to use, I should say, Lidia. Hey, Lidia, so 25 years of doing this, do you step back at all? I know you're as busy as any person on the planet, and think about how different things are on both sides of the camera, both in terms of you as teacher and the viewer as student, 25 years in?
I think that all the time. You know, I feel a certain responsibility, and I feel a lot of gratitude and reward in the position that I have. The responsibility is that I convey the simplest, the true Italian cuisine, because I'm a conduit of a cuisine. I'm not a chef inventor. And so I have that responsibility that what's happening in Italy, I bring to my home here in America now, my new home. And then the responsibility that they out there go and do it and cook. And you sort of, when I get an email and says, Lidia, you empower me. I feel good. I feel I can do it. That's the ultimate. I feel like, oh, I did my job.
Do you still learn things from your work? Do you learn new things about cooking? And
all the time.
Like
all
what?
The time.
Give me something in recent times that was new to Lidia Bastianich.
It's endless. You know, I go to Italy 3-4 times a year, you know, certainly now that COVID is over. And I do just that. I visit family, but I do research. And I go to, now Italy has 20 regions. So I travel to whichever regions I feel, you know, because each region sort of shines in a different time of the year, you know, and so like now in October, November, I would go up in Piemonte, you know, the truffles, the porcini, all of that. But some of the latest things, you know, in the southern regions of Italy, whether it's Puglia, which is the heel, or Sicily, or Calabria, those are the regions that sort of I found some of the things because I'm from the north, so that I didn't know. Like now it's all over the place. But let's say a few years, colatura di alici. Now, colatura di alici is fish sauce. The Chinese have it all the time. They use it all the time. The Italians have it. It's something different. But, you know, I didn't add that. And you know what colatura di alici is? You know, when the anchovies are made and they're sort of sprinkled with salt, and then the pressure is put on them. And that water that sort of seeps out, that kind of fermented juice of the alici, of the sardines, and the salt and all that, that's what that sort of intense flavor of the colatura di alici. And it's great. It is sort of brings an umami dish to a dish of pasta, risotto, soups, and so on.
Let me just say, if it tastes 1/10 as good as it sounds, it's a hit. Lidia, happy Thanksgiving. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Same to you, to everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy. Listen, relax. Don't be so uptight. Give them, you know what? Give them a good bottle of wine. Some nice wine, and you'll be just fine.
It's a deal. You're working your magic again. Lidia, see you soon.
Okay, ciao, ciao.
That's it for tonight. Please don't forget Ukraine.